Welcome to Module 4. Well done on getting this far. You spent precious time here to grow in your ethnic and spiritual journey and impact those you serve. In the last two modules, we've seen the ways expectations and values from Asian and Western communities function, and they apply both overt and subtle pressure to be more Asian or be more Western. In a fallen world, differences between groups, which should have been beautiful and celebrated, become barriers and conditions for belonging and acceptance. Well, I'm really excited about this module. We're going to look at what it's like when both sets of pressures are functioning and explore the in-between space of Asian and Western communities and why Asians between cultures may not feel broken at all. If we don't understand this, we will fail to identify the unique challenges of Asians between cultures and be ineffective in discipling and reaching them in their existential needs and their God-shaped whole. There are no generic Christians. We're going to see how Asians between cultures have reacted to both sets of pressures. So we see two kinds of pressure where the Asian community is pressuring Asians between cultures to be more Asian, and simultaneously the Western community is pressuring Asians between cultures to be more Western. There may not be many places where Asians between cultures can be accepted as both without feeling insufficient. Conforming to their cultures is the condition for belonging and acceptance and success in these communities. As part of our fallenness, we as human beings, as communities, have made conditions on who we accept, often without knowing it. And I consider this collective sin of omission, that we fail to accept and honour people and their culture unconditionally and sacrificially. Now, because of this sin, Asians between cultures experience brokenness and hurt. We may feel like we are always not enough. If only I could be more, then I wouldn't get hurt. If only I could be more, then people would like me. If only I could be more, then I could get a promotion. If only I could be more, then God might accept me. If only I could be more, then I might succeed in this society. I just need to try harder. When undealt with, hurt people will hurt people. And as we've seen, it affects our relationships with our Asian communities as well as our Western communities. We may pass on the pain by also asking others to be more to gain our acceptance, whether it is mocking our Asian communities for not being Western enough, or looking down on our Western communities for not being Asian enough. As a result, we will tend to elevate one culture over another. We fail to value each other as those in the image of God, and we fail to value all cultures and diversity as God does. We fail to love and accept each other as God does. And instead of grace-filled acceptance to outsiders and those on the fringe, we set boundaries and conditions for belonging. And what happens when we bring the pressures of remaining Asian and assimilating into Western together? It can potentially be quite confusing and tense within our communities and even within ourselves. How these dynamics manifest in you as an individual could vary from person to person. For me, I simultaneously elevated Asian pop culture and food and looked down on Western people in my Bogan community, yet simultaneously didn't want to hang out with FOBs considering them too Asian and favouring Western styles of education and communication. For others, it could be that you grew up feeling embarrassed about your parents' Asian dramas and didn't want to learn the language. You may have looked up to American celebrities and pop stars, but maybe going home and eating your Asian family's home-cooked meals and hanging with your cousins is still valuable to you. Still, for others, we may be largely unaware of these pressures in our host country. But as you experience life's transitions, for example, we might be in a very Asian environment as a child, but then start going to a university or workplace where we are the only Asian, or we may become an expat in an Asian country. Then we will start to feel these pressures differently. In other words, it might not be so straightforward, and you could have a mix of many of these dynamics or not. Now, living as a minority person, these pressures are inevitable. But sometimes we just don't feel them. Then the danger is when we are unaware of the dynamics of what's happening. Some of us may not feel pressures because we grew up with a solid Asians between cultures community, whether it's your language school, uni, workplace, or church. Now, in these spaces, there was very little pressure, and it's one of the few places where the be more messages are absent. and the natural place to stay when you're always being pushed with other pressures. But after a while, we may get too comfortable and exclusive without engaging with the Asian or Caucasian communities around us. And this too can be sinful. For me, when I discovered the Asian American community on YouTube, I thought, these are my people, and I got really consumed with it, with people who understood my experience and shared my struggles. In real life, I also hung out mainly with other Chinese Australians, and sometimes we would make jokes that probably alienated those who weren't Chinese Australians amongst us. For others, we may try to split ourselves into two. W.E. Du Bois calls this double consciousness or double self. With other Asians, you may try to be as Asian as possible, and work you might try to be as Western as possible. There's the Asian self at home and the Western self at work. Maybe the Asian self loves boba, ramen, and K-dramas and anime, but at work the Western self eats sandwiches, wraps, and talks about AFL or cricket. Your voice and your manner might even change. Now this too is not right because you always need to hide a significant part of what makes you you. Like Superman and Clark Kent, the two selves never appear together. Now this could become an issue if you want to share the gospel to a Western friend from school or work, to your English-speaking Chinese church, or an Asian uncle from your church is in the same class as you in Bible college. In these scenarios, which self are you going to be? Well, now what is especially difficult about all of this is that all these arrows, these dynamics, they are basically invisible. But yet, if we don't have a chance to stop and reflect on our own lives as well as our church, these dynamics can rule our lives and negatively impact our church, family, and society. But by working through these questions, we can start to see a way out. So let's consider, how do you navigate all the different pressures? In what areas might you elevate Western values? And what areas might you elevate Asian values? Conversely, where might you devalue these cultures? You can have a look back at the last two modules to answer this question. Now, if you don't feel much ethnic brokenness at all, could it be that you're either in the Asians between cultures refuge, or perhaps you've learned to use the double self way of living? If so, what do these dynamics look like in your everyday life? So to sum up, there are 4 ways ethnic brokenness manifests. 1, because of Asian pressure, there's either fear of Asian community or alternatively elevation of Asian culture at the expense of Western culture. 2, because of Western pressure, either fear of Western community or alternatively, there's an elevation of Western culture at the expense of Asian culture. 3rd, there is the in-between space, and 4th, there's double self. The way we navigate this brokenness will look different depending on the individual and what kind of environment you have been exposed to. It could be a combination, or perhaps one type stands out to you more. The result of this brokenness is that we may feel like we are not worthy, not good enough, and we may not feel complete belonging and acceptance. We might even project this onto God and the gospel. If we don't deal with this brokenness, it's very likely we'll pass on the pain. Hurt people hurt people. Our churches may become places of self-protection, exclusivity, and inward looking. And those of us affected by this pressure and feeling a sense of isolation and marginalization can pass this pain on, especially in the way we cast some communities as inferior while elevating others in order to be accepted or flourish. We might also be fearful and retreat to our safe place, unwilling to engage with the communities around us. Now please complete the questions in your workbook and I'll see you in the next module.